What happens when a flight attendant slaps a 5-year-old girl without realizing who her grandfather is? The boarding call echoed through the terminal. First-class passengers may now board. No rush, no noise. Just a soft movement, like the ripple of fabric when someone shifts in their seat. Harrison Ford walked with quiet steps, his left hand resting lightly on the shoulder of the small girl beside him. Emily was 5 small for her age, wearing a lavender dress and a pair of white sneakers that looked a size too big. In her arms a well-worn stuffed bunny, with one ear slightly more droopy than the other. She clutched it like something sacred. They reached their seats near the front of the cabin. Harrison glanced down to double-check the row. 2A and 2B. He nodded once, almost to himself, and gently lifted Emily into her seat by the window. She didn't protest, just looked around, wide-eyed, taking in the cream leather seats, the soft lighting, the polished tray tables that gleamed under the overheads. It was a different world. "Grandpa," she whispered, like she wasn't sure if it was okay to speak yet. "Can I look out the window?" Ford smiled, faint but warm, the kind of smile that didn't reach the lips as much as it settled into the corners of his eyes. "Of course," he said. "We fly better when we're curious." Emily pressed her nose to the glass. Below, workers in neon vests were guiding carts, loading suitcases, waving their arms with practiced, silent language. She watched, fascinated. Harrison settled into his seat next to her, adjusted his leather jacket, one that had clearly lived through more than a few winters, and exhaled quietly. A few rows ahead, a flight attendant moved with swift, efficient grace. She was young, maybe early 30s. Her name tag read Mariah, and her smile was the kind that clicked on and off like a light switch, bright when required, dim when not. As she walked past, her eyes landed on Emily, a child, in first class. The smile twitched. Her gaze flicked to Harrison's old jacket. No watch. Hair tousled like he didn't bother with product. No tie. No suitcase that shouted luxury. He didn't look like someone who belonged here. She said nothing, just leaned subtly toward her colleague, Charles, and muttered under her breath. Probably some standby upgrade or a favor. Charles didn't respond. Back at row 2, Emily turned slightly, her bunny now tucked under her chin. "Grandpa," she asked, "do clouds know we're coming?" Harrison looked out the window with her. "I think," he said slowly, "they always do. We fly quiet, and then the plane shifted just slightly as the doors sealed, and the world outside began to fall away. What no one realized, yet, was how quiet could change everything." Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The plane had been in the air just 15 minutes when the seatbelt sign chimed off. A subtle click. A few passengers shifted, unbuckled. One opened a laptop, another retrieved a book from a bag that didn't quite fit under the seat. Emily giggled softly. "That tickled my tummy," she whispered. Her voice barely made it over the quiet engine hum. Harrison turned to her. "That's called lift. The sky doesn't always welcome us gently." She nodded solemnly, as if that explained everything. The cabin lights softened to a mellow gold. Outside the window, clouds floated by like thoughts no one had said out loud yet. Then Mariah reappeared, pushing the drink cart like it owed her money. Her expression had returned to professional, but it didn't reach her eyes. Not quite. She moved quickly, stopping at each row with a bright, slightly mechanical cadence. "Can I get you anything?" she asked the man in 1B. He ordered sparkling water. She smiled. When she reached row 2, she paused. Her eyes landed on Harrison first, then drifted to Emily, who was sitting upright with her hands folded in her lap like she'd practiced it. "Water," Harrison said simply. Emily looked up. "Orange juice, please." Her voice was soft, not shy, just gentle. Mariah didn't speak. She reached for a bottle, poured, handed it to Emily with a paper napkin, no eye contact, no warmth, just mechanics. Harrison nodded in thanks. Emily did too, Then the plane lurched only slightly, a sudden jolt like someone tapping your shoulder when you're not expecting it. Emily's cup tipped, not a full spill, just a splash. The juice hit the tray table and dripped toward the seat's edge. Her eyes widened. She scrambled, grabbing the napkin, trying to blot it before it got worse. Mariah turned. Her eyes narrowed. "This is a VIP cabin," she said flatly, as if that explained everything. Emily froze, napkin in hand. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean she's just a child," Harrison said, calm, even, like a pilot mid-descent during light turbulence. Mariah didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on Emily. "You should teach her to be more careful," she said, arms folding. Harrison didn't argue. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a neatly folded handkerchief, and placed it gently on Emily's lap. "Here you go, sweetheart." Emily took it with both hands, nodding quickly. Her cheeks were flushed now. She wiped carefully, methodically, as if precision might erase the moment itself. A few passengers nearby turned their heads. One raised a brow, another glanced back at the attendant. "I said I was sorry," Emily murmured, almost to herself. Mariah stood still for a second longer, then turned. No response, no acknowledgement, just the sound of retreating heels. Emily slumped a little in her seat. Her bunny sat untouched beside her. She didn't cry. Not yet. The cabin settled again. That low, collective exhale after turbulence. Or maybe something else. Outside, the sky stretched wide in gray-blue, soft as brushed steel. Inside, things felt quieter than they should have. Not silent, exactly, but thoughtful. Watchful. Like the whole cabin was holding its breath, but couldn't explain why. Emily sat still, her little shoulders rounded in a way that didn't belong to a 5-year-old. She kept dabbing the tray table with the handkerchief, even though it had been clean for minutes now. Harrison leaned slightly toward her. His hand moved to her back, resting there, not guiding, just present. "You did fine," he said softly. Emily nodded, but she didn't look up. From the other side of the aisle, a man in a navy blazer gave a short glance. Not judgmental, just measuring. Mariah passed through again a few minutes later, holding a tray of rolled towels. Her pace was sharp, almost too purposeful. Her gaze flicked across row 2. She caught sight of Emily, still small, still sitting like she didn't belong. Her brow furrowed, then she moved on. Harrison didn't speak. He adjusted the corner of the blanket that Emily had draped across her lap. The bunny was tucked close now, its threadbare ear trapped beneath her chin. The overhead lights dimmed again. Night mode. The hum of the aircraft grew more noticeable, not because it was louder, but because everything else had gone so still. Emily stirred. Her hands tugged lightly at the hem of her dress. Then she turned. "Grandpa," she whispered, "do you think I should say sorry again?" Harrison looked at her, long enough for the words to matter. "If you feel it's right, sweetheart," he said. She thought for a second, then nodded. She didn't smile. She just stood carefully, quietly still gripping her bunny by one arm. Mariah was a few rows ahead, folding a service cloth with sharp, efficient hands. Her movements were tight, like she was trying to prove something. To someone. Emily stepped into the aisle, one step, then another. A passenger in row 3 watched as she passed, brows rising ever so slightly. "Ma'am," Emily said. Her voice was small, but it carried. Mariah turned, surprised, maybe, or just annoyed. "I'm really sorry," Emily said. "I didn't mean to spill anything. I promise." She tugged lightly on Mariah's sleeve. Not yanking, just a child's instinct to add weight to her words. Mariah's face darkened. Her voice sharpened. "Don't touch me." But Emily didn't let go, not from defiance, just sincerity. And then it happened. Smack. The sound wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. Mariah's hand, Emily's cheek, the silence that followed, a collective fracture. Emily stumbled backward, clutching her face, her mouth parted in confusion. No scream, just a small sound, like something broke where no one could see. Harrison stood, no urgency, no panic. He moved like something ancient and deliberate, folding toward her, arms open before she even reached him. Emily ran into his chest, and the plane, for the first time that flight, truly stopped. Emily buried her face into his chest. Harrison knelt slowly, not with drama, but with intention. He didn't speak, just wrapped his arms around her, one across her back, the other resting gently on the back of her head. His chin lowered, not to hide, but to listen, to feel the tiny, shaking breaths moving against him. A few passengers had begun to rise halfway from their seats, uncertain, not sure what they'd just seen, not sure if it could be real. One woman near the window clutched her coat. A man to the left mouthed something that never reached sound. "Did she just hit that child?" someone whispered. "Surely not," another replied, like denial might undo the moment. Mariah stood still, as if she didn't fully believe her own hand had moved. Charles, the flight attendant in the galley, stepped forward quickly. His face had gone pale. "Mariah," he said, not loudly but with weight, "what did you just do?" Mariah turned toward him, her posture stiff. "I taught her a lesson." She snapped. "She grabbed me. No one's taught her boundaries. Her grandfather just sits there." Harrison still hadn't looked up, still hadn't spoken. Emily's fingers curled around the collar of his jacket. She didn't cry loud, just trembled, the way a leaf does in wind you don't hear. The air around them shifted. The sound of the engines faded behind the new silence, thicker now. Like the cabin wasn't holding passengers anymore, but witnesses. A man in business attire leaned forward. A woman holding a baby pressed her lips together. Their eyes weren't confused anymore. They were awake, still. Harrison didn't move beyond the steady rhythm of his hand on Emily's back. Mariah adjusted her posture, visibly trying to recenter herself. She looked around at the stairs, now starting to turn cold. "Let's not make this into something it's not," she said. But the room was already made. Harrison finally looked up, not at her, but around, quietly. He scanned the space like he was reading something in the air, and the cabin seemed to lean toward him. Still kneeling, still holding Emily. He exhaled once, and that was it. Charles stepped beside Mariah. He didn't touch her, just stood, slightly in front now. His voice was lower. "You need to step away from this aisle." Mariah didn't move. She looked at Charles, then at Harrison. "He hasn't even said anything." "Exactly," Charles thought. But he didn't say it. He just motioned again. "Now." Mariah, reluctantly. She stepped back. But the damage didn't follow her. It stayed there in the row, with the man who hadn't raised his voice, in the space around the girl who hadn't screamed, and somehow that silence began to fill every seat. The SLAPS still lived in the air. Even after the sound of it faded, it had become something weightless, yet dense like ash suspended mid-fall. No one spoke. No one needed to. Emily was curled against Harrison's chest, her face buried just beneath his collar. She wasn't crying now, not loudly anyway, but her breaths came in short, uneven pulls. Her hand, still small and sticky with juice from earlier, gripped the fabric of his jacket like she was afraid to let go. He sat back down with her, slow, methodical. He buckled her seatbelt again with one hand, pulled the soft airline blanket over her knees, and adjusted her bunny into the crook of her arm. Then he leaned back and said nothing. But the silence around him shifted. It wasn't empty. It was occupied by attention, by weight, by judgment that didn't have a name yet. Across the aisle, Rosa, the woman from 3C, watched them. Her hand rested over her heart, her lips pressed together tightly, like something was trying to crawl out of her throat but kept getting swallowed down. 2 rows back, Louis, the man in the navy blazer, stood slowly, His movements weren't rushed. He stepped into the aisle like someone answering a quiet call. "Sir," he said, voice calm, low, respectful. "I don't mean to intrude, but if you need anyone to back you up, I saw it. So did others. We're with you." Harrison looked up. Finally, his eyes met Lewis's. No flash of anger, no surprise, just that same worn steadiness. The kind that came from a man who had been through worse and simply chose, this time, not to escalate. He gave a single nod, small, but somehow enough. Another voice joined in this time. "Rosa, I have a daughter," she said, leaning forward slightly. "And if someone did that to her, I don't know if I could stay as calm as you." She looked toward the galley curtain, where Mariah had disappeared. "Some people," she added softly, "shouldn't wear a uniform." No one interrupted her. Even the usual cabin noises, ice clinking in cups, fans whirring, felt muted, like the plane itself was listening. And then quietly, unintentionally, apologies began to surface. "I'm sorry," someone whispered. Not to Harrison, not to Emily, just out loud, into the air, like saying it might make something right, even if just symbolically. Whispers followed, deliberate, measured, no gossip, no chaos. That little girl did nothing wrong. She apologized twice. That woman just snapped. They didn't yell, they didn't shout, but they were no longer silent. It wasn't outrage, it was alignment, a kind of quiet, moral clarity that began to form its own perimeter around the girl, around the grandfather, around the moment that should have never happened. Rosa looked again toward Harrison, her voice just above a whisper. "She's strong," she said. Harrison finally spoke. "One day," he said, eyes still on Emily, "it won't have to be her burden." And the cabin went still again, not because it was stunned, but because somehow that line had sounded less like a hope and more like a promise. The galley was quiet, but not peaceful. The hum of the engine sounded louder back here, less like background and more like static pressing against the ears. Mariah stood with her back to the curtain, her arms crossed tightly, not out of confidence, out of containment, like if she didn't hold herself together, something might spill. Charles stood a few feet away. He hadn't said anything since she'd come storming through, just leaned against the storage panel with arms folded, watching her like someone unsure whether to speak or let the silence work first. Mariah rubbed her palms together, still felt it, the sensation, that tiny hand on her sleeve. She muttered under her breath, "She touched me." Charles blinked. Slow. "She's 5. Mariah's jaw tensed. "She grabbed me. She was apologizing." Mariah turned. "You weren't standing there." "I didn't have to be." He let that sit. Mariah looked away, jaw working. "I didn't mean to hit her," she said finally. "It just happened." Charles didn't move. "You crossed a line." Mariah stepped away from the counter. Her voice sharpened again, like it needed armor. "They shouldn't have been in first class. Look at them. He doesn't even speak. No tie. No anything. Probably some PR ticket giveaway or charity upgrade." Charles straightened just slightly. His tone dropped. "You don't know who he is." Mariah scoffed. "I don't need to." Charles didn't answer right away. He just watched her, not accusing, not dramatic, just steady. And that was worse somehow. "I've seen passengers lie before," she said. "Suddenly faster, less filtered. They cry, make drama, try to trap crew into saying the wrong thing. Maybe that girl's learned from her mother." "She's not with her mother," Charles said. "That's her grandfather." Mariah's fingers tapped the metal counter behind her. Her voice faltered. "Still doesn't give them a free pass to act like they belong here." Charles didn't raise his voice. "Belonging," he said, "isn't something you get to decide, Mariah." The hum of the engine filled the pause that followed. It wasn't awkward, it was necessary. like even the air between them needed a second to breathe. She turned her back to him again, arms tighter now. "I'm not the villain," she muttered. "I just snapped." Charles leaned in slightly, not unkindly. "And you think the passengers will forgive that?" She looked at him, then quickly looked away. "I know people," she said. "Upstairs. Raoul. He knows my work. This'll pass." Charles exhaled through his nose. Slow. "That's what you're betting on, connections. It's always worked before." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because back in the cabin, row by row, something had already begun to shift, and it wasn't going to fade with paperwork. At first, nothing happened. Passengers stayed seated, staring down at half-finished drinks or out windows that didn't show anything new. But there was a tension, now thin, but taut as if the air had shifted ever so slightly, and everyone could feel it tugging beneath the surface. Harrison hadn't moved. Still seated in 2A, Emily rested against his chest, not asleep, not fully. Her fingers toyed with the hem of her sleeve, slow and rhythmic, like she was trying to stay grounded in the motion. His hand stayed gently on her back, rising and falling with her breath. That was all. No speeches, no glares, no need. And yet, the silence around him kept growing heavier. A man 2 rows back stood. He didn't say anything, just stepped into the aisle and remained there, hands folded in front of him. A woman near the front rows too, holding her baby with one arm, the other resting calmly at her side. She wasn't protesting. She was witnessing. It wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. But it was happening. Presence. Rosa looked around, blinked slowly. Then she stood. Her hands shook a little. She hadn't realized that until now. She crossed the aisle and knelt quietly beside Harrison's row. "Sir," she said softly, "if you want to file something when we land, I'll stand with you. I don't know who you are, but I know what I saw, and I have a daughter." Harrison looked at her, that same worn calm, tinged with a kind of sorrow that felt personal. He nodded once. "I appreciate it," he said, from behind. Another voice joined Lewis. "I saw everything too," he said, stepping forward. He didn't make a scene. He didn't look for approval. He simply stood there. "We all did, and whether you speak up or not, we will." A soft murmur passed through the cabin. Not outrage, just agreement. A businessman added a quiet, "Me too." A teenage boy stood up slowly, his phone in hand but not recording, just held like a placeholder for action. And still, Harrison didn't move. He didn't need to, because something was shifting, not just in the people but in the plane itself. The rhythm of service had broken. No one asked for drinks. No one offered pretzels. Even the flight attendants on the opposite end kept their eyes low, unsure how to reset the moment. Back in the galley, Isabella turned toward the curtain. "Have you spoken to him?" she asked Mariah. Mariah folded her arms. "I don't owe him anything." Isabella paused, voice lower now. "Then you don't understand what's happening." And out in the cabin, one by one, passengers began to stand, not for confrontation, not for spectacle, but for something else entirely, for the kind of silence that deserved to be answered. It started with a shift in breath. Harrison adjusted the blanket draped over Emily's knees. Her stuffed bunny had slipped toward the floor. He picked it up, placed it gently back into the crook of her arm. She stirred but didn't lift her head. Her eyelids were heavy now, but not from rest, from something else. Then Harrison stood, not quickly, not with dramatic weight, just purpose. The cabin noticed. No one spoke, but posture changed. Rosa straightened in her seat. Lewis, already standing, took a respectful step back, not in fear, but in understanding. A couple near the emergency exit stopped mid-whisper and looked up, not sure what they expected. But sensing it was coming, he didn't look around. He just turned, stepped into the aisle, and walked. The sound of his footsteps on the soft carpet didn't carry, but somehow each one felt loud, Not aggressive, not vengeful, just solid. Like they weren't about going forward, but about going through. He passed the flight attendants. Charles saw him first, his expression unreadable. Isabella stepped aside instinctively, not in submission, but in recognition. Mariah stood behind the curtain, organizing towels that didn't need organizing. She felt the shift before she saw it, the atmosphere turning denser, like someone had adjusted the pressure inside the plane. The curtain parted, and Harrison was there. She froze. He didn't speak, didn't raise a hand, didn't even furrow his brow. He just looked at her, and in that stare something broke. Not loudly, not visibly, but inside. Mariah stood straighter, out of reflex, then immediately regretted it. His gaze wasn't cruel. It wasn't even angry. That would have been easier. This was different. It was steady. It said, "You know what you did, and you know I know." Behind him, the cabin had gone still. Passengers didn't lean out into the aisle. They didn't gasp or whisper. They just waited for him to do something. But he didn't. He simply stood there, holding her in place with nothing more than presence. Mariah tried to hold eye contact, failed. Her gaze dropped first to the galley floor, then to her hands. They were trembling. She wanted him to say something, wanted to know where this would go, wanted to brace for a punch that wasn't coming, but Harrison said nothing, because sometimes silence is a sentence. He turned, walked back down the aisle the same way he'd come, unhurried, unshaken. And somehow, that silence behind him got louder. Back in his seat, he eased down beside Emily again, adjusted her blanket, brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. She didn't ask what happened, and he didn't explain, because she already knew. The seatbelt sign lit up again with a soft chime. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our initial descent into Los Angeles International Airport." The captain's voice was smooth, unremarkable, but nothing in the cabin felt routine anymore. Harrison had returned to his seat. Emily stirred beside him, her eyes blinking open slowly. She didn't say much, just shifted a little, her cheek finding the fold of his coat again. She was awake but not fully present, as if her body had landed, but her spirit was still trying to catch up. She gripped the bunny's ear tightly. Harrison adjusted her seatbelt, gently, the way someone does when they've done it 1,000 times but still care each time. Across the aisle, Rosa was watching, not in curiosity, not anymore. In recognition, she turned slightly toward the man in 3B Lewis. Her voice was quiet, just above a breath. "Is that who I think it is?" Lewis didn't look away from Harrison. "I think so." Rosa hesitated. "I've seen him before, but not like this." Lewis nodded. "There's something in the way he holds himself, the way no one questions when he stands." The whisper passed like a ripple down the rows. No one said his name, not out loud, but you could feel the puzzle pieces sliding into place. The way he didn't flinch under pressure, the way he chose stillness over spectacle, the way silence seemed to form around him like gravity. Another voice, a teenager this time, leaned toward his father. "Is that?" The father didn't answer, just placed a hand on his son's knee and nodded once. By the time the landing gear unfolded beneath them, with its usual mechanical groan, the passengers weren't watching the clouds anymore. They were watching Harrison, or rather, watching the space around him, watching what he hadn't done, and how much louder that was than anything anyone else had. In the galley, Mariah sat stiffly on the jump seat, knees locked, hands clenched in her lap. She didn't look up. Couldn't. The weight of the cabin's silence pressed down on her now. Not punishment, just absence. No one came to speak with her. Not Charles, not Isabella. No one defended her. And that was the shift she hadn't prepared for. Harrison hadn't said a word to her. No accusation, no threat. He hadn't even raised his voice. And yet everyone knew. Everyone had seen it. Isabella walked the aisle slowly, collecting empty cups. She didn't stop at 2A, just passed by quietly, a soft nod in Harrison's direction. He nodded back. No smile. No words. At the front, the cabin door clicked and opened. Two men in dark blazers stepped aboard. One of them wore a badge. Raul, director of flight operations. He scanned the cabin, eyes calm but focused. And when he saw Harrison, his face changed. Just slightly, but enough. He walked forward. No hesitation. "Mr. Ford," he said, voice measured. Rosa's hand flew to her mouth. Mr. Lewis straightened instinctively. Even the teenager sat upright, holding his breath. Raul continued, lowering his voice only slightly. "On behalf of the airline, I deeply apologize for what's happened today." No one needed further explanation. The name had finally been spoken, and with it, the weight of everything that came before landed. For good. The plane had landed. The wheels kissed the runway with a soft jolt, and the engines slowed into that familiar winding hum. The seatbelt sign dinged off, but no one moved. Not yet. Something unspoken held them in place. A collective pause. Not of confusion, but of recognition, like people in the presence of something final they weren't ready to let go of. Harrison remained seated, his arm gently cradling Emily as she sat upright now, half tucked into his side. Her face was quiet, a little tired. Her fingers played absently with the soft edge of the blanket. Her cheek no longer red, but the memory was still there. Not painful anymore, just present. Mariah was brought forward, not escorted. Exactly, but she wasn't walking on her own terms either. Her blazer looked stiff. Her eyes were red at the edges, like she hadn't blinked in too long. Her steps were too even, like she was still pretending she had control. Raul faced her at the front of the cabin. "Mariah," he said, with a voice that had practice behind it, "you're suspended, effective immediately. A full investigation will follow. You will not return to service today. No gas, no applause." No one needed that. The cabin didn't want a spectacle. It wanted closure. Mariah didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. For once, she said nothing. Charles stood just behind Raul. He didn't look at her. Not in anger. Just didn't. And then Harrison stood. The motion was slow, deliberate. Emily stood with him, holding his hand. The blanket slid off her knees and pooled quietly on the seat. As they walked toward the exit, a flight staffer offered a small toy plane to Emily. She took it with both hands, looked up at the woman, and gave a soft, fragile smile. It was the first smile anyone had seen since takeoff. Harrison placed a hand gently on her back as they stepped off the plane. There were no cameras waiting, no press, just the quiet terminal beyond the jet bridge. Ordinary life, but somehow not ordinary anymore. Mariah stood still, surrounded by uniforms she used to match. She turned her head as if looking for someone, anyone to validate her, but no one met her eyes. Even Charles had stepped away. And that more than anything was the verdict. Because in the end, Harrison never raised his voice. He never pointed, never condemned. He just watched. He stayed present. And somehow that silence had echoed louder than any outburst could have. As they disappeared into the tunnel, Rosa whispered to Lewis without turning her head. He didn't say a word to her. Lewis nodded. He didn't have to. The doors closed behind them, and the cabin remained still for just a moment longer. Because sometime, the loudest justice is silence. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.